to visit. Fishermen steer clear of its shores. Water taxis won't stop there. Maps often omit it entirely. This is Poveglia Island, a place so haunted, so deeply infected with darkness, that the Italian government has forbidden public access. Just 2 miles from the bustling grandeur of Venice's St. Mark's Square, this unassuming island has accumulated more human suffering per square foot than perhaps any other place on Earth. For those who study paranormal phenomena, the question isn't whether Poveglia is haunted, but rather how anything natural could possibly remain on an island so saturated with death. The dark history of Poveglia Island begins in the year 421 CE. As barbarian invasions swept across the Roman Empire, refugees fled to the Venetian lagoon for safety. While many settled on what would become the main islands of Venice, others found sanctuary on the small, marshy island of Poveglia. For centuries, these earliest inhabitants lived simple lives, farming the fertile soil and fishing the surrounding waters. By the 9th century, the island's population had grown substantially. The community on Poveglia built homes, shops, and churches. Records from this period describe a peaceful, if isolated, settlement. But this tranquility would not last. The island's strategic position would soon transform it from a sanctuary into a prison. In 1348, the Black Death arrived in Europe. This devastating plague would eventually kill up to 60% of Europe's population. Venice, as a major trading port, was particularly vulnerable. The city's response was brutal but pragmatic: create a firewall between the infected and the healthy. The city's council quickly passed laws requiring ships to anchor offshore for 40 days before entering the port, giving us the word quarantine from the Italian 40 giorni, meaning 40 days. But what of those who were already sick? This is where Poveglia's transformation from humble sanctuary to island of horror began. The Venetian government commandeered the island, forcing its residents to leave. In their place came those infected with the bubonic plague, thousands upon thousands of sick and dying people. Many were still alive when they arrived, their skin covered in painful, blackened buboes, their bodies racked with fever and delirium. Massive plague pits were dug across the island. Bodies were stacked and burned day and night. The smoke from these pyres was visible from Venice, a constant reminder of death's proximity. Those who were merely suspected of carrying the disease were sent to Poveglia to live among the dying and the dead. For many, a journey to Poveglia was effectively a death sentence. When the plague subsided, the island remained abandoned for nearly 3 centuries. Few dared to set foot on what had become known as the Island of the Dead. But Poveglia's darkest chapter was yet to come. In 1793, several cases of plague were discovered on 2 ships in the Venetian lagoon. Immediately, the ancient protocols were reactivated. Once again, Poveglia became a lazaretto, a quarantine station, where the sick and dying were sent to be isolated from the general population. This second period as a plague island lasted until the early 19th century. By this point, some estimates suggest that over 160,000 people had died on the small island. The soil of Poveglia is said to be composed of 50% human ash. To this day, fishermen avoid the area, fearing that their nets will bring up human bones rather than fish. But the island's capacity for human suffering was not yet exhausted. In 1922, the existing buildings on Poveglia were converted into a mental asylum. Even by the standards of early 20th century psychiatric care, what transpired within those walls was exceptionally cruel. The isolation of the island meant there was little oversight. Patients were subject to experimental treatments and procedures with little regard for their well-being. At the center of this cruelty stood a doctor whose name has been carefully erased from official records. According to local legends, this unnamed physician performed cruel lobotomies and other experimental procedures on his patients. He used crude tools like hand drills, chisels, and hammers to remove portions of their brains, allegedly in an attempt to find a cure for mental illness. The doctor's methods were brutal beyond comprehension. Patients were taken to the asylum's bell tower, where the sounds of their screams would be masked by the bell itself. There, strapped to tables or chairs, they endured unimaginable pain as the doctor systematically destroyed their brains piece by piece. Many died during these procedures, others survived, though perhaps death would have been kinder. The exact number of patients who suffered under this doctor's care is unknown, but estimates range into the hundreds. For years, his reign of terror continued unchallenged. Then suddenly, it ended. According to the most widely told version of the story, the doctor began to see shadowy figures moving about the island. At first, he dismissed them as hallucinations brought on by stress and isolation. But as time passed, the figures became more distinct, more threatening. They whispered to him, telling him they were the spirits of the patients he had tortured and killed. Whether driven by guilt or fear, the doctor climbed to the top of the asylum's bell tower, the very place where he had conducted many of his horrific experiments. There, he either jumped or was pushed to his death. Some versions of the story claim that he survived the fall, only to be strangled by a mysterious mist that rose from the ground and enveloped him. After the doctor's death, the asylum was closed. The island has remained mostly abandoned ever since. During World War II, it was briefly used as a military outpost, but soldiers stationed there reported such extreme paranormal activity that the position was abandoned. In the 1960s, there were plans to convert Poveglia into a retirement home, but the project was quickly abandoned. Today, Poveglia stands empty and decaying. Its buildings slowly crumble into the lagoon. Vegetation has overtaken much of the island, nature reclaiming what man has abandoned. But according to those who have visited the island, both legally and illegally, Poveglia is far from unoccupied. The most commonly reported phenomenon on Poveglia is the sensation of being watched. Visitors describe feeling hundreds of eyes following their every move. Many report sudden feelings of extreme dread or sadness that disappear as soon as they leave the island. Others describe hearing screams, moans, and whispers, particularly near the former asylum and bell tower. Physical manifestations are also common. Visitors have been scratched, pushed, and even choked by invisible forces. Electronic equipment frequently malfunctions on the island. Batteries drain inexplicably. Cameras capture strange orbs and mists that weren't visible to the naked eye. Some photographers have discovered mysterious figures in their photos that weren't present when the pictures were taken. Perhaps the most disturbing reports come from the asylum's bell tower. Though the bell itself was removed decades ago, many visitors claim to hear it tolling, especially at night. Others report seeing a spectral figure standing at the top of the tower, only to watch in horror as it leaps or is pushed to its death, reenacting the doctor's final moments. But the entity that gives our story its name is something altogether different. Something more malevolent than the confused spirits of plague victims or tormented asylum patients. Something that locals believe was not born of human suffering, but rather attracted to it, a dark presence that fed on pain and death until it grew powerful enough to take physical form. In 2016, a team of paranormal investigators received rare permission to spend a night on Poveglia. The team consisted of 4 experienced researchers: Marco, an Italian psychic; Sarah, an American medium; David, a British equipment specialist; and Elisa, a skeptical historian who specialized in Venice's darker history. They arrived on the island just before sunset, loaded with cameras, audio recorders, EMF detectors, and other tools of their trade. At first, the investigation proceeded normally. The team documented cold spots, unexplained noises, and several compelling EVP recordings. David's equipment captured numerous anomalies, battery drains, electromagnetic spikes, and unexplained temperature fluctuations. But as midnight approached, both Marco and Sarah began to sense something unusual. This wasn't the confused energy of lost souls, or the residual trauma that haunted places of great suffering. This was something sentient, something watching them with calculated interest. "There's something here," Sarah whispered, her breath visible despite the warm summer night. "Something that doesn't belong." Marco nodded. "It's old. Older than the island. Older than Venice itself." The team made their way to the asylum building, where both began to move toward him with an unnatural gait, as if its joints bent in the wrong directions. As it drew closer, Giuseppe realized it was inhumanly tall and thin. Its arms hung down past its knees. Its face was obscured by what looked like an old plague doctor's mask, a long beak-like protrusion extending where the nose and mouth should be. Terrified, Giuseppe retreated to the shed and barricaded the door. Throughout the night, he heard something circling the small building, occasionally scratching at the walls or roof. Just before dawn, there was silence. When morning came, Giuseppe emerged to find deep gouges in the wooden walls of the shed, marks that could not have been made by any normal human hand. More disturbing, he found a perfect circle of dead vegetation surrounding the shed, as if something toxic had killed every plant within a precise radius. Most unsettling of all, when he returned to his boat, he found it inexplicably dry-rotted, the wood crumbling as if it had been abandoned for decades rather than hours. He barely made it back to the mainland before the vessel completely fell apart. Giuseppe never returned to the waters near Poveglia. He told his story only once, to his grandson, shortly before his death in 2012. The grandson shared the account with researchers on condition of anonymity, fearing that even speaking of the entity might somehow draw its attention. In 2018, a photographer named Elena Miraglia captured what might be the clearest image yet of Poveglia's entity. Elena was part of a small documentary crew that had received permission to film on the island during daylight hours. While setting up a shot of the asylum's exterior, Elena noticed something strange in her viewfinder, a tall, dark figure standing in one of the upper windows. Thinking it might be a crew member who had wandered into the shot, she called out. When no one responded, she took several photographs in rapid succession. In the first image, the figure is clearly visible, tall, thin, and wearing what appears to be a long, black cloak and beaked mask. In the second photo, taken less than a second later, the window is empty. When Elena reviewed the full resolution image later, she discovered something even more disturbing. The figure's mask appeared to be part of its actual face. What she had taken for a beak-like mask was a genuine anatomical feature, a long, curved protrusion where a human nose and mouth should be. Elena showed the photo to her colleagues, but by the next morning, the image had inexplicably been corrupted beyond recovery. Only a low-resolution preview remained, just clear enough to make out the basic shape, but not the disturbing details Eleanor had observed. The documentary project was abandoned when 3 crew members developed mysterious respiratory illnesses that doctors were unable to diagnose or treat effectively. All 3 recovered after several weeks, but none would agree to return to Poveglia or even discuss what they had experienced there. Paranormal researcher and historian Dr. Alessandro Battaglia has spent years compiling accounts of encounters with Poveglia's entity. After reviewing hundreds of reports spanning more than a century, He has identified several consistent elements. The entity is invariably described as unusually tall and thin, with elongated limbs and what appears to be a bird-like or beak-like face. It is most often seen near the bell tower or on the upper floors of the asylum, though occasionally it is encountered near the shoreline, apparently watching approaching boats. Electronic equipment malfunctions in its presence, batteries drain rapidly, digital storage becomes corrupted. Those who encounter the entity often develop mysterious illnesses afterward, particularly respiratory problems reminiscent of those suffered by plague victims. Most disturbingly, people who see the entity report a sensation that it is somehow familiar, as if they have known it all their lives, or as if it has been watching them long before they came to Poveglia. Dr. Battaglia's most controversial theory is that the entity is not confined to Poveglia at all. The island is merely its stronghold, he writes, a place where it has fed so well and for so long that its presence has become physically manifest. But it can reach beyond those shores when it chooses, following those who have seen it, entering their dreams, influencing their thoughts. He cites numerous cases of people who visited Poveglia and later reported strange experiences far from the island. Shadowy figures glimpsed at the foot of their beds, the smell of decay in otherwise clean rooms, the sensation of being watched while alone. One particularly disturbing case involved a student named Paolo who visited Poveglia on a dare in 2005. 3 weeks after his return to Rome, his roommates found him in a catatonic state, staring at the corner of his room, where, according to his later testimony, the entity had been standing every night since his visit to the island. When asked why he hadn't fled or called for help, Paolo gave a response that Dr. Battaglia finds particularly significant. It wouldn't have mattered. It followed me from the island. Distance means nothing to it. It could follow me anywhere.
Paolo recovered after psychiatric treatment, but maintained until his death in a car accident 3 years later that the entity was still watching him. His final text message to a friend, sent minutes before the fatal crash, read simply, "It's here in the car with me."
In 2020, during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, Venetian locals reported something strange. As the normally crowded canals of Venice emptied of tourists and even residents stayed indoors, multiple people claimed to have seen a tall, thin figure standing on the shores of Poveglia, looking toward the city. Most disturbing were reports from healthcare workers at Venice's hospitals who described seeing a tall figure wearing what they initially took to be old-fashioned PPE, including what looked like a plague doctor's mask, watching from outside the windows of COVID wards. When security was called, no one was ever found. Several patients reported seeing the same figure standing at the foot of their beds in the middle of the night. All who reported these sightings died within 48 hours, despite having been expected to recover. Marina Contarini, a nurse at one of these hospitals, quit her job after repeatedly seeing the figure. It was as if history was repeating itself, she told a local newspaper, as if the entity of Poveglia was feeding on a new plague. In the summer of 2022, a group of American tourists ignored warnings and traveled to Poveglia at night, live streaming their adventure to followers online. The stream showed them exploring the overgrown grounds and entering the crumbling asylum. About 40 minutes into the live stream, as they approached the bell tower, viewers noticed something the explorers themselves did not, a tall, thin shadow that seemed to be following the group, always just at the edge of the frame, moving with an unnatural, jerky motion. In the comments, viewers tried to warn the explorers, but the group didn't notice the messages. The stream continued as they entered the base of the bell tower. Then suddenly, their lights went out. In the darkness, viewers could hear confused voices, then screaming. When the camera light came back on seconds later, it was lying on the ground, pointing up at one of the explorers, a young woman named Bethany. She was being lifted into the air by something not visible on camera, her feet dangling several feet above the ground, her face contorted in terror. Then the stream cut out. The Italian Coast Guard responded to emergency calls from viewers, but by the time they reached Poveglia, they found only the abandoned equipment. The 4 tourists were missing. 3 days later, 3 of them were found drifting in a small boat near Lido, with no memory of how they had escaped the island or what had happened to Bethany. She remains missing to this day. The survivors refused to speak about their experience, but one, under hypnosis during a therapy session, described seeing Bethany pulled up into the darkness by something with arms too long to be human and a face like a bird's skull. The most recent reported encounter with the entity occurred in January 2023. A maintenance worker contracted to check the structural integrity of Poveglia's buildings went missing during what should have been a routine daylight visit. Search parties found no trace of him until, a week later, his boat drifted into St. Mark's Square. Inside was the worker's phone, containing a single video file. The shaky footage shows him exploring the asylum's ground floor. He narrates calmly, pointing out structural damage and areas of concern. Then, mid-sentence, he falls silent. The camera continues to record as he slowly turns around, apparently responding to something behind him. The image blurs as the phone is dropped. For several seconds, there is only audio, a strange, dry rustling sound, and what might be words in an unidentifiable language. Then the phone is picked up again, apparently by someone much taller than the worker, as the perspective is now looking down from above. The final frames show a glimpse of what appears to be the worker being dragged across the floor toward the stairs leading to the bell tower. His expression is not one of terror, but of odd acceptance, as if in a trance. Then the video ends. What is the entity of Poveglia? A collective manifestation of centuries of suffering? A demonic presence attracted by the island's dark history? Or something older and more fundamental, a genius loci or spirit of place that has been corrupted by the horrors it has witnessed? Perhaps the answer lies in ancient Venetian folklore, which speaks of the plague bringer, a spectral figure with a beaked face who was said to appear before outbreaks of pestilence. The earliest records describing this figure date back to well before the Black Death, suggesting that the entity may have been present long before Poveglia became an island of death and madness. Or perhaps the truth is something science has yet to comprehend, a being that exists simultaneously in our reality and another feeding on human suffering as we might consume food, growing stronger with each tragedy that unfolds on its island domain. Whatever the truth, Poveglia Island remains closed to the public. Its decaying buildings continue to crumble into the lagoon. Venice's locals still refuse to fish near its shores or speak its name after dark. And on foggy nights, those looking toward the island from Venice's southern shore sometimes report seeing a tall, thin figure standing at the top of the bell tower, watching the city with patient, ancient eyes. The entity of Poveglia watches and waits. It has fed well for centuries, and if history is any guide, it will feed again